If Adam and Eve were the universal progenitors of mankind, they had to be ancestral to both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and therefore plausibly identified with the last common ancestor.
Welcome to Closer to Truth, where we explore deep questions of existence, including arguments for and against the existence of God, and if there were a God, what might follow. Closer to Truth promotes no privileged position. Rather, we seek precision and clarity in diverse, even conflicting ideas. We do not mind challenging current belief. I am speaking with William Lane Craig about his new book, In Quest of the Historical Adam. Bill was ranked by academicinfluence.com as the 10th most influential philosopher and the third most influential theologian in the world. Bill is recognized as a leading defender of theism in general and of Christianity in specific. The premise of our talk is that God exists and the Bible, in some sense, is valid. This is not the premise of Closer to Truth, which examines the former but not the latter. Bill, it is great to see you. It's been too long. Why the historical Adam? Why years of research? You must have known that whatever you're going to find, you're going to upset biblical literalists or secular evolutionists, or most likely both. What's at stake here, which is the title of your opening chapter?
For years, my wife Jan and others have been encouraging me to write a systematic philosophical theology. And I realized that if I was to undertake such an arduous task, I would need to bone up in certain areas of systematic theology that I felt weak in. And one of those areas was theological anthropology. In particular, the question of human origins and what in the world you do with Adam and Eve. And so I decided to devote a couple of years to this subject in particular in preparation for writing this larger work.
Okay, well, that's very significant. Now, this is not going to be a detective story. So up front, what's your conclusion, the thesis in brief of the historical Adam, and then we'll go into depth.
I think that there are two central theses of the book. The first is that a correct literary analysis of Genesis 1 to 11 shows that this literature belongs to the genre called mytho-history, and therefore need not be interpreted literalistically. The second thesis would be that it is entirely compatible with contemporary evolutionary anthropology, that there have been a primordial human pair who are the universal ancestors of mankind, who lived somewhere around 750,000 years ago, and whom I identify tentatively as members of the species Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man.
Both of those conclusions, I would think, would ruffle the feathers of certain biblical literalists. Is that not the case?
It is the case, Robert, and unfortunately, the fires of controversy have already been stirred by the appearance of the book. Too many people have jumped to conclusions without first reading the book and engaging with my arguments.
Let's start with the grounding assumptions. As I said, we're assuming that God exists and the Bible, in some sense, is valid. So why then is Adam and Eve so important? And what, again, are your grounding assumptions, the beliefs or doctrinal commitments which were sacrosanct and inviolate in preparation for this research?
Well, for many Christians, the doctrine of original sin is a central doctrine. And obviously, that doctrine would have to be given up if there was no historical Adam. We cannot be held culpable for the sin of a person that never existed. Now, I myself don't hold to the classic doctrine of original sin, that we are morally guilty for Adam's wrongdoing. But I do think that as a biblically committed Christian, I am committed to the historicity of an original human being through whom sin and evil entered the human race. I believe that's the teaching of the New Testament, and I think it's what Jesus of Nazareth believed. So if I were to adopt the position that such a person never existed, this would cause real reverberations in my theology. I would have to revise my doctrine of inspiration so that I could say the Bible, though inspired by God, teaches falsehood, and that Jesus, though divine, held false beliefs. And those would be pretty major revisions to make. So I'm happy to report that I don't have to make either one of those because I do think that it's entirely compatible with contemporary science that there was such a primordial human pair.
Okay, so just to be clear, the importance of the historical Adam and Eve is based more on the New Testament in terms of Jesus's words than it is on Genesis 1, the early chapters of Genesis. Because if it's mytho-history in Genesis, it's hard to discern what is mythical and what's history. But so the core assumption you're making is based on Jesus's words, not Genesis.
Jesus and Paul in the New Testament. That's right. Now, I think that they go to confirm what Genesis suggests. I don't regard Genesis as pure myth. I call it mytho-history, which means it's a kind of blend of history with the figurative and often colorful language of myth. So I think that Genesis does commit us to the idea of an original human pair that actually existed, real people, but that the stories about them are colored with the figurative language of myth.
So at the beginning, ab initio, what were the key issues? What were your set of initial questions? We have your assumptions, your grounding constraints, if you will. But what were the questions you began to ask for this extensive period of research?
The absolutely central and fundamental question for me was this analysis and classification of the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11. I think that determines everything in terms of what I, as a biblical Christian, am committed to. So that was fundamental. So I bracketed the whole scientific question until later, after determining what my biblical commitments are. And only then did I begin to look at what the evidence of contemporary science tells us about human origins.
I find it interesting that after 4 or 5 decades of some of the most fascinating and in-depth research in very highly specific biblical topics, that still you had to go back
Yeah.
almost freshly to look at your commitments to Genesis.
For years, I've sort of swept Adam and Noah and the Tower of Babel and the rest of Genesis 1 to 11 under the rug. I just didn't know what to do with it. And it was the task of writing this systematic philosophical theology that finally forced me to confront this issue squarely and honestly. And it was not easy. It was an agonizing process, I have to say, personally.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Did you have an initial hypothesis going in and then testing that against theories, or were you pretty much tabula rasa looking at what the evidence would say?
I thought that I would locate the persons of Adam and Eve in the distant past. I figured that that was the way it would work, that I would affirm what's sometimes called the antiquity of man rather than a recent origin of man. But that was just very general, and the specifics then were fleshed out in the course of the research.
Now, we're going to go into some highly specific material in the book, but I just want to now get your sense of your mental state during the research process, because I've done some things myself and I've admired what you've done. I've admired over the decades where you've taken tough subjects that are controversial, spent a huge amount of time on it, and come out with very specific positions. You don't waffle. You come out with some things that are original, controversial. I'm not going to agree with all of them, but I admire your approach in coming up with that. So in the process of research, let me just ask some general questions. Do you remember the first discovery or conviction that you had that was that you didn't expect or that changed your mind?
I do. I attended a couple of conferences on the origin of humanity and theology, theological anthropology. And it was at that conference that I heard the Old Testament scholar Bill Arnold speak on the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11. And it was as though someone turned on the light for me. What Arnold argued was that Genesis 1 to 11 belongs to this genre of literature that the eminent Assyriologist Torkild Jakobsen had identified as mytho-history. And as Arnold described the characteristics of this genre of literature, it just seemed to me to apply to a T to Genesis 1 to 11. And so for me, that was an enormous turning point. I think hearing Bill Arnold and his analysis was really a life-changing experience for me.
Did you have any misunderstandings in the process?
Do you mean in the process of the entire research, or?
Yeah, in other words, did you go down did you find a blind alley that you thought you were making progress and then had to stop?
No, that didn't happen to me at all. It was very progressive in terms of one thing leading to another, but it did cause me to change some views. For example, I came to the quite different opinion that according to Genesis 2 and 3, Adam and Eve were created mortal rather than immortal. That sin is not the result of their fall, but that rather they were created as mortal creatures and would have died anyway, even if they hadn't fallen into sin. And that was quite a new view for me, very different theologically than what I believed before.
And very different theologically than what is traditional Christianity. What about the tree of life and the tree of good and evil? If they didn't, would they have died if they didn't eat from that tree?
I think that what Genesis is telling us is that they died spiritually as a result of their disobedience to God. They experienced alienation from God. But when they ate the fruit of the tree, they didn't just drop over dead on the ground physically. It's talking about a spiritual death. And I think that's what Paul is also talking about in his disquisition on Adam's sin in Romans chapter 5. And so I came to see the fall as the spiritual death and alienation of man from God, not a source of his physical mortality.
That spiritual death, that was that an instant or was it a lifetime, especially in the conclusion of your book that puts Adam 750,000 or so years ago?
While I don't take the story of the fall literally in terms of eating fruit and so forth, it does seem to me that this represents a moral decision to rebel against God, to turn against God. And we can well imagine that at some point in their lives, Adam and Eve did make such a decision, so brought sin and moral evil into the human race.
Bill, as I go through the book and comparing your very original ideas, both theologically and anthropologically, with others who have dealt with this question, a critical focus to me was the definition of what is human. So, how would you define human?
Yes, I would say in order to be human, an organism needs to be, first of all, anatomically similar to ourselves. We are paradigmatic humans. And so another organism to be human would need to be anatomically similar. Then, secondly, it would have to exhibit certain cognitive behaviors that are characteristic of humanity, like the ability to grasp symbolic thought, planning for the future, certain sorts of technologies and innovations. And these characteristics are widely agreed upon by anthropologists as being the sorts of cognitive features that define what human beings are. And the anthropologists that I read then identify what they call archaeological signatures of these cognitive behaviors. And the goal then is to probe the past to see when these archaeological signatures first appear. And this can help us to close the window, so to speak, to determine exactly during what window of time humanity appeared on this planet.
So now I'm going to ask a complicated question, so please bear with me. So what I want to do is I'm going to give you four terms or four categories of words which clearly overlap in some sense. And I want to get your a sense of how these four areas articulate with each other. So the first one we just discussed, that's the term human. The second one is the genus Homo, which includes extinct varieties of archaic humans, Neanderthals, Denisovians, Heidelbergensis, as you've said, as well as modern humans. Third category is Homo sapiens. And then the fourth category, those who bear the image of God.
Yes.
So we have four humans, Genesis Homo, Homo sapiens, and image bearers of God. How do they articulate? Maybe as if they were Venn diagrams.
I would identify human with image bearers. Those are synonymous terms.
Okay.
However, we cannot assume that any hominin that is classified as Homo is therefore human. Ian Tattersall has made a point that when they began to discover these ancient hominin forms like Australopithecines, were very unclear about how to classify them. And this resulted in a sort of lumping strategy where these different forms were lumped into Homo or Australopithecus without serious differentiation. And so there are some hominins that are classed as Homo, which had a brain size so small that it couldn't possibly have exhibited the kinds of cognitive behaviors that are typical of humanity. So we cannot go by the classification of Homo in order to determine the parameters of humanity. Now, with respect to Homo sapiens, one of the central theses of the book is that to identify human with Homo sapiens is far, far too narrow a construal of human. There were other human species in the past, like Neanderthals and others, who exhibited all of the same cognitive behaviors that Homo sapiens did. And it would be, I think, unscientific, as well as, frankly, morally unconscionable to write them out of the human race simply because they weren't Homo sapiens. So that leads me to think that if Adam and Eve were the universal progenitors of mankind, they had to be ancestral to both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and therefore plausibly identified with the last common ancestor of those two members of the human family, namely Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man.
This is a critical point of your book. It's a provocative one. It's controversial, and from my perspective, whether it's right or not, it is a wonderful probe on how we think in general about theological anthropology. So I really love this stuff, even though I may not agree. Let me ask the question in a slightly different way. Could it be that only a subset of Homo sapiens manifest the image of God, and Adam and Eve are the progenitors of all and only those individuals, even though others in that species would be at least anatomically the same? Is that...
I do address it, though I do not think that that is a view that is theologically acceptable, nor do I think it is scientifically or morally acceptable. If you take that route, Robert, you would have to say that there are people who exhibit the same sort of cognitive behaviors, artistic appreciation, aesthetic and moral appreciation, and yet who are not human, who are subhuman. And I think that's scientifically untenable. They exhibit all the same behaviors that we do. And it's morally untenable for us to think that there were segments of Homo sapiens that are not human. And I would say the same of Neanderthals as well.
The key is where you make that differentiation. You said yourself, as you go back in the homogenesis, at some point you're cutting off. Where is that point is a probative question.
That is the burden of the second half of the book.
Okay.
Where
Right.
we identify that point in prehistory when humanity plausibly originates. And as I say, these archaeological signatures that I talk about are so ancient, Robert. They go back hundreds of thousands of years before the advent of Homo sapiens. And I give one example after another in the book that are just stunning, that show that it would be unscientific to cut off humanity too soon as you probe back into the past.
I'd like to go a little deeper on this image bearers versus Homo sapiens that you make a very strong point on. And I took interest in the strange story in Daniel 4, where King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was, quote, driven from men and dwelt with the beasts of the field. Then in Daniel 4:16, it says, let his heart, which means the mind, be changed from a man's heart, and let a beast's heart be given to him, and 7 times pass over, which is, we believe, 7 years. Then a few verses later, 7 years later, he says, my understanding returned. So in the biblical context, it's the only place I see this difference between a man and a beast in the same physical individual. I mean, there's no report that Nebuchadnezzar's cranial capacity shrunk when his man's heart was changed to a beast's heart. But something changed. I hate to use the word substance, something in Nebuchadnezzar, whether physical or non-physical, something was changed. Now, you could say that was a sui generis one case, but if it's in the Bible and the consistency of the whole Bible, to me, that's a possible signal of differentiating human from non-human.
Well, that's very interesting, and I've not considered that in this context. I've always taken that to be a description of mental illness of Nebuchadnezzar, that he went temporarily insane and then eventually came back to sanity, so that this was a description of someone who was severely mentally ill.
Okay, so I've been focusing on cranial capacity as perhaps necessary but not sufficient to define humans or image bearers, and I'm a little hesitant to say this because it's very personal. But I had an older brother who was born before I was, who was born microcephalic, with a severely reduced brain size, well below non-human hominids for sure. He died when he was 5. I never got to know him. And my mother had a nervous breakdown. My father was in World War II. It's a very personal story. So when I read the book, that resonated with me. And if I believed in the Bible and I was committed as you are, I would want my brother to be an image bearer as a real category. And I'd hope he'd be included, even though his brain capacity was far below any cutoff that we would make.
Yes. I think what one could say in a case like this is that while brain capacity would be sufficient for humanity, it wouldn't be necessary so long as he had a rational soul. Even if his brain was too underdeveloped for that rational soul to operate correctly, he nevertheless was an image bearer. And so in the last part of the book, when I get into the theological question of what it means to be in God's image, I do affirm body-soul dualism and argue for it both biblically and philosophically. and maintain that humanity originates when one of these hominin forms that is sufficiently anatomically similar to us to have a brain and nervous system that can carry a rational soul becomes ensouled by God and therefore becomes a body soul composite and fully human.
This is a very big subject. We focus on it on Closer to Truth. You and I discussed it many years ago, and I look forward to further conversations along those lines because I think that's a very probative and important topic, and it obviously relates to what we have here.
Yes.
Let me ask you about language. How important is language, and when did human-like language appear in evolutionary history?
Again, language would be one of those indicators that we are dealing with someone who is fully human, because language requires the capacity to use words as symbols to refer to things. Now, the difficulty is in trying to figure out, of course, when language first appears in human history, is that until writing is developed, we have no way of detecting language because it was purely oral. But you can show through these various archaeological signatures that some of these hominin forms did have the sort of cognitive capacity that would naturally be expressed in language, and that they engaged in behaviors that probably required communication and cooperation so that language was probably present. You can also show anatomically that there are certain very telltale signs that are necessary for language ability. For example, the muscles that control breathing are extraordinarily finely tuned to regulate speech. And there isn't any other plausible explanation of this kind of musculature apart from the fact that these hominins were language users. That's just one example that's discussed in the book. There are also some genetic clues of genetic mutations that occurred prior to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens that are associated with language ability. So there are certain clues that do suggest that language goes all the way back to Heidelberg man.
We recently had the opportunity to speak quite extensively with Noam Chomsky, almost 93, super sharp, was great speaking with him. And he pointed me to his book, which he did with MIT professor of computational linguistics Robert Berwick, called Why Only Us? Language and Evolution. And what they say is that language, which they have as a universal grammar, which is Chomsky's famous concept, emerged in a very narrow window of evolutionary time, perhaps only 80,000 years ago. It has not evolved since. And they put boundaries saying it must have arisen between 200,000 years ago as the outside limit and as early as 60,000 years ago. How does that interrelate?
I think that would definitely be a minority position, Robert, and I think it would be extremely implausible in light of the increasing antiquity of these archaeological signatures that I've described. I don't think there's any hard evidence that would say that language only goes back that far and no further.
What's the importance of population genetics to your work in tracing back to historical Adam and Eve? And did your understanding shift during the research process?
Yes, this was one of the motivations for undertaking this research. I had read and talked with certain scientists who claimed that the data of population genetics shows that our contemporary population could not have derived from a single human pair at any time in the past, that the number of humans on this planet never could have gotten below a certain minimum threshold of several thousand. And so this was one of the issues that I knew I needed to tackle in the book. And what I found, quite to my surprise, is that those estimates turned out to be erroneous, and that even those who were originally propounding this view came eventually to acknowledge that if you place the origin of humanity prior to 500,000 years ago, then it is perfectly consistent with the evidence of population genetics that the human race could have derived from a single primordial pair who lived prior to 500,000 years ago.
I know you've interacted with Dr. Joshua Swamidas, a computational biologist at Washington University in St. Louis, who has his own theory about the genealogical Adam and Eve,
Yes.
with a book of the same name. He focuses on a more recent Adam and Eve, perhaps even as recent as 6,000 years ago in some relationship to the Bible, I assume. Your Adam and Eve goes back far more than his. So how do you articulate the two projects? I know you guys are friends, but certainly disagree on this one point, even though very firmly agree on the importance of having a historical Adam.
Well, it's important to understand, first of all, that what Josh and I are doing are offering proposals. We're not taking hard and fast positions. We're saying these are two proposals for understanding the historical Adam. Josh has a recent genealogical Adam. I have an ancient genealogical Adam. So the hypotheses are similar, but they differ in the date of Adam and Eve. And I disagree with the idea of a recent genealogical Adam theologically, because I think that one of the essential theological teachings of the creation narratives in Genesis is that Adam and Eve were the universal progenitors of mankind. They were not a selected couple out of a wider population of people. There is a kind of universal interest in the opening chapters of Genesis to show that this was God's plan for mankind as a whole. And it's only later then when he calls Abraham that you have a kind of election out of the wider humanity to select a people for himself. So theologically, Josh and I would disagree with how we read Genesis 1 to 11. Scientifically, I would reiterate the point I made before, that I think it's just completely unjustified scientifically to say that these people who exhibited the same cognitive behaviors that we do were not human. And that would be, as I say, also, I think, just morally unconscionable. So for those reasons, I'm pretty strongly opposed to the view of a recent genealogical Adam.
Just want to be clear that when you're using the term human, you are saying that's synonymous with image bearers of God, because others, and I think, but maybe Josh is included, I haven't spoken to him about this, but would maybe have image bearers being a subset of humans in some
That's sense. Right. That's very possible. He's not. I don't think he has a firm position on this. He likes to talk about people outside the Garden of Eden. And by that, what he means is merely an interbreeding population. But were they human or were they subhuman? He's not entirely clear, and I don't think that he takes a hard and fast position on that. So it could be that only the descendants of Adam and Eve bear the image of God on his view, and that these people outside the garden are not image bearers, and therefore, in that sense, not human.
Yeah, as you're defining human, you can define human in some other sense, and image bearers is a subset of that. That's just a semantic issue. What do you do with Genesis 6, which talks about the giants in the earth in those days, the Hebrew word for giants, Nephilim, and then enigmatically the sons of God and the daughters of men interbreeding. Is there any data that you can draw from that? It's always enigmatic.
I don't think there is, Robert. I think at the end of the day that what the author is contemplating there is angels In the biblical worldview, angels can take on human form. And if you believe that, it's not surprising that they could copulate with human females. And that seems to be what that story is about. And God then punished them for that transgression.
Nothing in reverse with female angels doing the copulation?
Say again?
Nothing in reverse. In the modern age, we have equality and gender equality. No female angels coming down to engaging with
As far as I know, angels are only portrayed as male in the Bible. I don't think I can think of any case of a female angel, interestingly enough, even though on our Christmas cards and other things of that, we often have female angels, but they were masculine figures in.
Right. Let's move on to the mechanism that you propose for the creation of Adam and Eve, because it is not a de novo creation of Adam from the earth, Adaman, and then Eve from Adam's rib as per Genesis, but some kind of divine genetic modification. I hate to put it this way, like a GMO tomato that has been, not to be too glib here.
That terminology. Genetically modified organism. And it's possible that's what Adam and Eve were. But that's not really part of my proposal, Robert. I'm not really concerned in this book about how humanity came into being, but just when. I want to locate the time at which humanity originated. But whether they were created miraculously from the dust of the earth, or whether there was this sort of radical biological and spiritual renovation of a non-human hominin form, is a matter of indifference to me. I simply assume the current evolutionary paradigm to say, is there anything incompatible with the current evolutionary paradigm and belief in a primordial human pair who were the universal progenitors of mankind? And I see no incompatibility between those two.
And I appreciate the constraints on your thinking. It's just that I like to, and Closer to Truth like to, look at the implications of ideas, even if they're speculative, because if they turn out to be incompatible and incoherent, that might reflect on how we think. So it's fun to speculate and ask these questions, but it also has some substance too, in terms of seeing what the implications of these ideas, because I think if it was a genetic modification, I think you talk about it might be at the embryonic stage, or even in the gametes of the parent, because if the gametes of the parent, you make a very good point, then Adam and Eve would have been human from conception, rather than not human from conception and then the change after that. So that's a speculation on your part, and I think that's a very interesting way to explore the whole concept. But what it would mean either way, embryonic or gamete, is that Adam and Eve had non-human parents.
Yes, although, as I say, that's not part of my proposal, but I'm saying that there's no incompatibility between Adam and Eve and the evolutionary paradigm whereby they had non-human parents.
Okay. You state that the genetic modification, however it occurred, would equip the organism with the neural structure to support a rational soul. And I think that rational soul is critical to making human, or the image bearers of God, however you define it. You couldn't have it with a cranial capacity at whatever size by itself. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's correct, that you need to have a rational soul in order to be truly human.
So we say truly human. Could you be partially human without it?
Okay, to be human.
Okay. I want to be very clear.
Yeah.
All right. So what is this rational soul? I mean, we don't want to take too much time. We'd love to do a whole hour with you on that. Is it the classical immortal soul? And when?
I think the question of its mortality or not is secondary. We mean what philosophers mean by a mind. when theologians speak of the soul, that's what philosophers mean by a mind, a sort of mental substance that is endowed with faculties sufficient for rationality, intentionality, moral choices, and so forth.
In the Bible, some people talk about, again, in the early chapters of Genesis, so it could be Mytho-History, the God breathed in, and the words are nefesh chaya. Nefesh is sort of a living, chaya is living, nefesh is like breath or soul. But it's a term that also, I think, in the Bible applies to fish and land creatures, humans, kind of the same term. I mean, is that helpful in trying to discern the rational soul?
I don't think so. I think these early Hebrew terms, as you say, had a broad range of meanings. And it really isn't until later Judaism that you clearly get the sort of body soul dualism that characterizes Hellenistic Judaism at the time of Christ, then is pervasive in the New Testament.
I did my doctorate in neuroscience, and I've had a long interest in the mind-body problem, and a sometime interest in the Bible, and that's why that little story in Daniel 4 intrigued me, because it seemed like there is something that combines with the cranial capacity that you need in order to make a human mind. That something is there and could be taken out or put in. Now, maybe that's reading too much into it, but that's why that story also had interest, to see if there's anything, because this would be such an important thing to understand from a biblical point of view, if it's the rational soul and mortal soul. So is there any information that we could get to discern what that is? Because if we look at the time of Jesus and Hellenistic Judaism, a lot of that obviously is derived from a Greek and Platoism.
Yes, that's right. And I think that the clearest evidence for body soul dualism in the New Testament is when Paul contemplates the so called intermediate state between the death of the body and its eventual resurrection at the end of the world. He doesn't think the lights go out when you die. He believes that you go to be with the Lord and you are in a closer conscious communion with Christ in that disembodied state of the soul without its body. He calls it a state of nakedness. Um, and I think that firmly commits Paul and the New Testament to this sort of dualistic anthropology.
Bill, in science, we always try to find falsification kinds of strategies in order to validate scientific principles, and it doesn't quite apply to many things biblically. But I like to kind of phrase it this way: is that based on your two primary pillars of your work, which is the mytho-history of Genesis 1 to 11, and the anthropological consistency with a genealogical Adam and Eve, what would be the kinds of evidence, whether scientific or biblical, that could alter your conclusions? What would those be?
Well, with respect to the genre analysis of Genesis 1 to 11, if someone else could show that the evidence that I adduce for Genesis 1 to 11 being mytho-history could be better explained by another literary genre, then that would falsify my position. And that's one of the things I'm really going to be looking for, Robert. I'm not interested in people just denouncing my view. I want people to show me that they can explain the evidence that I give by offering some other genre analysis that explains the data as well as the one I offer. Scientifically, I do not think, frankly, there's any hope that one will be able to overturn the evidence for how ancient modern cognitive behaviors are, because the archaeological signatures are there, they are tangible, and the progress or the record has been older and older and older. Discoveries keep being made. So my hypothesis that Adam and Eve are Homo heidelbergensis would probably be falsified by pushing the origin of humanity even further back that showing that Adam and Eve plausibly belonged to a late form of Homo erectus, say, something like that. And that's certainly scientifically possible. Homo heidelbergensis is a very shadowy figure of which we know little. And so that is the area that I think will bear the most watching is what we learn about human origins as these archaeological signatures are pushed further and further into the past.
What's been the reactions to your obviously original, and some would say startling, and some would say counter-biblical conclusion?
Well, apart from the denunciations by people who have never read the book, I have to say that I have found among Christians a surprising openness to my proposal. I have found among most people that they're tired of these old debates over young earth creationism and whether the world was created 10,000 years ago and things of that sort, and they're anxious for a new paradigm. And so I have been very pleased with the open-mindedness that I have encountered among my fellow Christians to these proposals.
We talked a little bit about the fall, but the fall, which at least in some sense is a core Christian doctrine, is has to be radically reinterpreted or done away with almost totally.
Oh, not on my view, Robert. I believe in a historical fall, that there was a first moral choice whereby Adam and Eve experienced spiritual death and were alienated from God. I just think that this is told in a very imaginative and figurative way using a tree of knowledge of good and evil, a talking snake who tempts them to sin against God, a God who is physically and bodily present with them in the garden. I take this to be all part of this colorful imagery in which this historical event is narrated.
And so your Adam and Eve of roughly 750,000 years ago went through a decision process, because as it's told in Genesis, it's a very short period of time. I don't know, a few hours or a day. I don't know how long it is there. But in the historical sense, as you would have it, and taking that mytho-history and then applying it to the real events that occurred 750,000 years ago in order to give the fall some real substance and maintain that doctrine. Do you need to worry about how it occurred? Was it just a decision in a few hours, or was it over a lifetime?
I don't think there's any way to know. I think that once you think that this narrative is related in figurative and imagistic language, that you cannot press it for those kinds of details.
Okay, well that's a good part of my life, trying to find details which are impossible to find. So I'm staying in character. Where does historical Adam research go from here?
Well, I have moved on now to the writing of my systematic philosophical theology. And so I'm working currently on the doctrine of God and studying the various attributes of God to see if we can develop philosophically coherent understandings of concepts like omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, eternity, and so forth. So I'm always moving forward, and the historical Adam stuff is just now appearing, but it was in press for over a year. So there's a sort of time lag there.
Look, I appreciate it. It's great speaking about this. As always, even when I disagree, I always admire your taking on tough topics and offering definitive positions and not being afraid to defend them. We invite viewers to watch Closer to Truth videos with William Lane Craig at closertotruth.com or Closer to Truth's YouTube channel. We'll be doing more with Bill. And Bill, it's great to see you. And good luck on the systematic theology and the philosophical theology. And when it's finished, come on back. We'll talk about it.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.